Let's talk about the time in 1911 when a photographer announced that he had broken into the Salt Lake City temple for the LDS Church, had taken nearly 70 photos, and threatened to expose the temple's interior for the entire world to see. While initially scandalous and a crisis for the church leaders when it first came out that September of 1911, this episode ended up being a major win for the LDS Church, led to a number of important developments, including a PR victory and the introduction of a new quasi-canonical text for the LDS tradition that is still beloved today. So in September 1911, the Salt Lake Tribune, a newspaper well known for trying to skewer the LDS Church back then, made a startling announcement. Gisbert Bassard, a lapsed Mormon, had broken into the LDS Marquee Temple and had the photographs to prove it. They then published a handful of those photographs of the temple's interior, including several of the endowment rooms, the celestial room, the assembly hall, and many other interior rooms. And perhaps most embarrassingly for the church, the photographs of some of the church's leadership meeting rooms included spittoons, showing that church leaders were still chewing and spitting tobacco. Now, Bassard was trying to find a buyer for all 68 photos and was hoping to do a traveling show to display them. As you might imagine, the church was furious. This was trespassing into their most sacred space, a violation of the divine, not to mention a breaking of the law. But rather than suffering humiliation, they instead steered into the skid, to use a modern metaphor, decided to open up talking about the temple, produce their own photographs, and eventually publish their own book. So in this video, I want to lay out this entire episode and its saga. I'll discuss the photographer's background and his agenda. I'll highlight what we can learn from those photos, which are still important to historians, and I'll show you some of my favorites. And then I'll demonstrate how the church responded, including some of the lasting legacies. Much of what I'm going to say here is based on a wonderful article that was published in Dialogue in their fall 1996 issue by Kent Walgren, titled Inside the Salt Lake Temple, Gisbert Bassard's 1911 photographs, and I'll link to it in the description so you can go check it out on your own. And as we approach next year's open house for the Salt Lake City Temple and the frenzy that I'm sure it's going to prompt, I hope you'll enjoy revisiting one of these previous moments when a lot of attention was on that temple's interior. Gisbert Ludolf Gerhard Bassard was born in Prussia in 1890. He lost both of his parents at a young age, but then migrated to Utah with his stepfather in 1905. He was a convert, though it seems he lost his faith shortly after arriving in Utah. He was ordained to the priesthood, but married outside the faith, and he wasn't the one that blessed his two young children. His stepfather would later say that Bassard, quote, says he still believes the gospel is true, but thinks the administration and business affairs of the church is crooked, showing you that there were people with those critiques back in 1911, just like you have people with those critiques in 2026. Near Bassard's 20th birthday, he became fixated with photographing the interior of the Salt Lake City Temple. It was a symbol of the LDS faith. The building had also played a crucial role in the major Reed Smoot hearings the decade before, a point of national fascination. Here, for instance, is a political cartoon that was published in the Salt Lake Tribune during the Smoot hearings, emphasizing that the church in general, and Smoot in particular, was hiding behind the temple's secrecy, that they used that cloak of sacred disclosure or lack of disclosure as a way to hide what's actually going on. So the Salt Lake City Temple, in other words, represented this institutional hierarchy that acted with impunity that Bassard detested. Now, Bassard didn't actually break into the temple so much as he gained access through nefarious ways. He became friends with one of the temple's gardeners, Gottlieb Woolrich, who lived close to the temple, had keys to the garden access, and therefore easy access. Bassard convicted Woolrich of his critiques, and in turn was able to get access, sneaking in both day and nighttime. Here's a photograph of the entrance to the garden room annex where they grew the the plants that would then be used in the garden room, which is where Bassard likely got access. But he also was hired by the church to do some electrical work and learn how to enter a tunnel that went to the temple, which is also how he got into access during the day and night. He would eventually take 68 photographs, likely during that year of 1911. At first, he tried to sell the negatives to the church as a form of blackmail, demanding $100,000 with limited success, or with no success, actually. The church soon had people following him when they realized he had these photographs, and his apartment at one point was ransacked, though I'll note that the church denied that they were behind it, although the evidence seems like they were. And in September 1911, once Bassard had made financial arrangements for a public display, he took a train to Denver, hoping to get rich from the scheme. Here is, by the way, a photograph of Bassard on the left and Max Florence on the right. Max Florence was a prominent businessman who was kind of the brains behind the publicity operation, someone that the church did not really like, given a number of other things that Florence had done. Now, he and Florence reached out to Joseph F. Smith, demanding the $100,000, which I mentioned before, and Smith, as you might imagine, was outraged. Joseph F. Smith was known for his anger. If you haven't read Steve Taysom's wonderful biography, I strongly recommend it. This is how Joseph F. Smith responded to that offer. Quote, "I will make no bargain with thieves or traffickers in stolen goods. I prefer to let the law deal with them." The church's initial public response was to emphasize that, well, we let people in the Salt Lake Temple during the open house and a couple of decades earlier, that they had published a brochure with some images, so people should know. And further, they smeared both Florence and Bassard, saying that they were conniving fools. They highlighted previous infringements on the law. And in response, Bassard and Florence, here is a political cartoon that they commissioned showing that they are dodging the angry bull of Joseph F. Smith and the LDS Church. So you can see this caused a lot of heightened fury. So let's talk about the photographs at the heart of this whole crisis. But before we dig into those photos, just a reminder that if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, what are you waiting for? You must enjoy this type of nerdy content where I do deep dives every Monday, I connect the past with the present every Wednesday, and on Fridays I pull back the curtains and talk about the historian's craft. On the first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion at 7 p.m. Mountain Time where I can answer your questions. And if you can't get enough, you can subscribe to my Kit newsletter. I send out newsletter blasts every other Sunday or so, and you can follow me on my different social media platforms, TikTok and Instagram particularly, where I do videos and posts that supplement these broader videos. And if you want to give back to support this channel, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to these videos, you get little icons next to your names, and most importantly, you know you are supporting public-facing responsible scholarship that I and my producer Anthony are trying to produce. All right, all that said, let's get back to the history. As I mentioned before, Bassard had about 68 photographs, so that number is a bit in question, that cover all different elements of the temple, interior and exterior. The quality is not great, as you might imagine, given the technology and the nature in which he was taking these photos, but they're still quite useful. Here, for instance, is a photo of the Garden of Eden room. Note the murals on the wall, murals that sadly aren't in the Salt Lake City temple anymore, a topic that I'll mourn in another video. Note the large number of wooden chairs where people participated in the endowment. Here is a photograph of the telestial or world room, including the staircase that Peter, James, and John would go up and down during the ritual performance in the endowment. And sadly, that live performance element is no longer going to be the case of the Salt Lake City temple, much to the chagrin of many members. The doors on the right of the photograph are going to the celestial room. Going to the terrestrial room. Sorry, I got that wrong. Speaking of the celestial room, here's a statue, or a photograph of a statue that was in the celestial room, which featured a woman with the torch at the top, Joseph and Hiram on the sides, and then Joseph experiencing the first vision at the bottom. Here's a photograph of the first presidency and quorum of the 12 meeting room, and if you look close on the bottom left, you'll see a spittoon, which shows that they're still chewing and spitting tobacco. Here's the Aaronic priesthood pulpits in the assembly room and the grand assembly hall. That's really, really cool. If you haven't had a chance to go into, it's wonderful, and I hope they kept it how it was in the past. Bassard, by the way, was also photographed in temple robes, that he wanted to be part of this expo, but it was clear he was never endowed himself because he didn't know how to put on the robes, which church leaders made fun of when they got access to those photographs. Now, most of those 68 images that did not see the public eye, for reasons I'm going to talk about in a bit, were eventually scattered across different institutions. And the scholar Kent Walgren, who wrote the article that I'm drawing most of this from, was able to hunt many of them down, including 4 wooden crates that were hidden in the library of the Grand Lodge of Freemasons in Utah and Salt Lake City. I recommend going to the article, which again I'd link to in the video description, if you want to see more of these photographs, which I promise are worth your time. As I mentioned before, the church was outraged at this. They saw this as a violation of their sacred space. At first, they wanted to bring charges against both Bassard for trespassing, but they also wanted to charge Max Florence, the businessman behind the publicity part of it. But they were told that he likely was not liable for any charge. But instead, they took a different route. The Mormon academic James Talmage had an idea. What if, instead of trying to hunker down and deny and smear, what if they stole Bassard's thunder and published their own photographs of the Salt Lake City temple in their own pamphlet? He made this pitch to them just days after the Salt Lake Tribune published the first batch of letters, and the First Presidency liked Talmage's idea. This is the letter they wrote in response to the meeting. Quote, "Your communication on the 18th instance, suggesting the publication of a book dealing with temples in general and with modern temples in particular, to contain interior as well as exterior views of our temples, was considered at our council meeting yesterday, resulting in an action favoring your suggestion. Also, in an action appointing you to prepare the manuscript in the suggested booklet, the same to be revised by a committee to be appointed by ourselves for that purpose. We have arranged with Brother Ralph Salvage to take the interior views of the Salt Lake Temple, and we would like you to supervise that work." Once word got out that the church was taking their own photos of the temple that they aimed to publish, Florence tried to beat them to the punch with copyright, but the Mormons were too quick, and Talmage and Salvage already had photographs of the Salt Lake Temple by the end of the month. They also benefited because one of Florence's main contacts in New York City at the New York Times was a newspaper man by the name of Isaac Russell. And you wouldn't know it by his name, but Russell was actually a descendant of Parley P. Pratt and still an active member of the LDS Church, who was corresponding with the LDS Church unbeknownst to Max Florence, and slow-walked Florence through the ways so that by the time Florence realized that he wasn't getting much traction with them, the LDS Church had already beaten them to the punch. And what's remarkable is that this plan by the LDS Church worked. Few theaters were willing to rent space to Florence and Bassard, and when they did secure a theater, the company that they hired to produce slides for their show ended up canceling the contract days before in favor of a contract with the church. And the big newspapers chose to carry the LDS Church's photographs rather than Bassard's because they were better quality and they felt they would get in less trouble. When Bassard and Florence finally had their big opening at a theater in New York City, only a few people showed up. And 2 of those people were reporters from the Deseret News. And so, in other words, this big promise that came with the announcement in the Salt Lake Tribune ended up being a thud. And most of those images were never displayed to the public. In fact, Bassard was so humiliated that he tried to come back into the good graces of the church. Just the next year, he wrote a letter to Joseph F. Smith that said this, quote, "You will no doubt be surprised to receive a line from the undersigned, i.e. me, but I feel it is my duty to apologize and ask your forgiveness for the unjust attacks I made upon you. The latest developments have shown me that every member should thank God that leadership of the church is in the hands of such men like you. I searched for truth and I found it, which makes me a strong supporter of your policy and the gospel. It means that the case of Paul has itself repeated once more in history. My first act will consist in turning over the temple photos to you without charge. Mr. Florence will leave Monday for Salt Lake and turn everything over to the church. I sent Bishop Perry a letter in which I explained everything in detail." I will note, Florence did not turn over the photographs to the First Presidency because Bassard was willing to mend faces. Florence was not. Neither, when talking about people interested in building that bridge, neither was Joseph S. Smith interested. He responded to the bishop of Bassard saying, quote, "The treachery and greed which prompted the desecration of the house of the Lord is entirely another thing, something which cannot be so easily disposed of," denying Bassard's request for rebaptism after he had been been excommunicated. Now, Bassard stayed in the church at least for a few years and even defended the church in public in some instances. But when he wasn't welcome back, within a few decades, he was once again on the anti-Mormon speaking stump. His wife eventually divorced him, moved back to Utah, and she was able to go through the temple endowments, gaining access just like he never officially had. But perhaps the longest legacy that came out of this whole ordeal, in which the church won the resulting PR endeavor, was the book the church ended up producing as a result of the fracas. About a year after the Salt Lake Tribune first broke the news of Bassard's photographs, James Talmage's book, The House of the Lord, the book the church had commissioned him to write, finally appeared. Now, Talmage was already a well-known author in the LDS Church. He had written several really important books, the Articles of Faith, Jesus the Christ, that really shaped the LDS theology in the 20th century. I want to do a video on him at some point. He wrote this book, The House of the Lord, in a matter of months. And he was actually ordained an apostle while he was working on it. So he started as just an LDS intellectual. By the time he published it, he was an apostle. And it included, this book, 46 images, some of which the church had published in a pamphlet earlier that year and in newspapers in order to blunt Bassard's photographs. The aim of this book, The House of the Lord, was to normalize the temple, to tamp down the exoticism of these Gentile assumptions and the exotic fascination seen in the response to Bassard's photographs. It was also aimed to connect Mormon modern temple worship to ancient practices. And therefore, in a way, this book was the foundation for modern Mormon apologetics, trying to explain temple worship previously kept secret to the modern world. And a big part of that was a detailed description of both the interior of the temple and the nature of the rituals, the endowments, the sealings, the washings that took place in there. And yes, that included a lot of photographs, 46 photographs overall, 31 of which were of the Salt Lake City temple interior. Just to give you a taste of some of them, here's one of the hallway, which I show just because I love how the dark wood and rich color is a deep contrast to the much more whitewashed temples they would later do. There was word that they were going to be returning the Salt Lake Temple back to this dark wood and rich color. Sadly, that doesn't appear to be the case anymore. You can also see these dark colors in the image of the celestial room, which you see here. Here is another image of the Holy of Holies. As far as we know, one of the only photographs we have of the Holy of Holies in the Salt Lake Temple, in which they do their second anointing ordinance. And don't worry, when he did publish images of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 meeting rooms, he was smart enough to remove the spittoons so that they didn't see that they were still chewing and spitting tobacco. The book satiated much of the public interest. But it also taught the Latter-day Saints how to speak of their temple, becoming required reading for decades, shaping the boundaries of what can and cannot be said about the temple. And it all came as a result of the threat from Bassard to expose everything that went on inside that structure. I hope you found this video useful. If so, hit the like button and share with friends so we can broaden the discussion. I think the story is important on a number of fronts. First, it's just a fascinating story in itself, in which there was a major crisis that ended up turning into a PR win for the church, showing them how to adapt to the new age. But it's also important in shaping how the LDS Church viewed, understood, and explained their temple to the broader world. It's also important because the images that came out of this, both Bassard's images and the salvaged Talmage images, are still used by scholars today to understand the temple structure and the ordinances that took place. So I hope you keep this story in mind as you might go attend the Salt Lake City Temple Open House next year and all the attention that's going to come. I think this is a great reminder that history has never been more relevant than it is today, because it allows us to view the various moments and crises and personalities that brought us to our present moment, introducing frameworks that might not have been understood before but are now just taken for granted.